McDermott, and in this video we're going to take a look at two campaigns that were particularly significant during the Civil War. The first is the culmination of the most serious effort on the part of the Confederacy, or the part of a Confederate army, to invade the North, the battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And in the second case, a battle that took place not far south of Nashville, Tennessee, at Murfreesborough, which then allowed the Union Army to occupy Chattanooga and begin a deep penetration into the South to Atlanta, a continuation of dissecting the Confederacy, which had begun, of course, with the opening of the Mississippi River. But first, Gettysburg. Following Chancellorsville, the two armies took up their old positions on both sides of the Rappahannock River near Fredericksburg, where they had previously gone into winter quarters. Convinced that Confederate success could only come through offensive action, and knowing he could not successfully attack the Union Army of the Potomac in its current location, General Lee left a covering force and began shifting his army to the west. He planned to invade the North again, forcing General Hooker into a battle where the Union could be defeated. By the 17th of June, the Confederates were spread out over 100 miles, crossing the Blue Ridge Mountains and moving down the Shenandoah Valley, moving north, down the valley toward the Potomac River. By 28 June, the Army of Northern Virginia was in Pennsylvania, and by then General Hooker had also marched and concentrated the Union Army of the Potomac, staying between the Confederates and Washington, D.C. Demanding additional reinforcements, which were not forthcoming, General Hooker threatened to resign. And much to his surprise, President Lincoln, unwilling to chance another outcome like the Battle of Chancellorsville, particularly on northern soil, accommodated his demand by replacing him with General George Meade on the 28th of June, just 3 days before the battle would actually begin. The Confederates were converging northwest of Gettysburg on the 30th of June, with the exception of General Stuart and most of the rebel cavalry. They were off on another ride around the Union Army, depriving General Lee of timely intelligence concerning federal movements. General Lee had cautioned his commanders against being drawn into a battle before he could concentrate the army. But the fight started on the 1st of July when Confederate infantry attacked Union cavalry that were already deployed west of Gettysburg. The Federals fought to deny high ground to the rebels, and before the day was over, 22,000 Union and 27,000 Confederate troops had been fed into that fight. Confederate soldiers succeeded in occupying the town of Gettysburg, and the Federals pulled back to entrench on Cemetery Hill, immediately south of the town. During the night and the following morning, the bulk of both armies arrived to take up positions. The Federals established a strong defense in the shape of a fishhook, starting from Culp's Hill, which is located southeast of Gettysburg, up to Cemetery Hill, behind the town, and then south along Cemetery Ridge for almost 2 miles, stopping just short of two prominent hills that were not defended. The first of those two elevations, known as Little Round Top, and the second was called Big Round Top. The southernmost portion of the Federal line had also pushed to the west, off of the high ground of Cemetery Ridge, forming a salient that was vulnerable to Confederate attack. And of course, General Lee soon identified that weakness. The Confederate Army was positioned in an arc starting northeast of Gettysburg, facing Culp's Hill, and then swinging west and then south. The rebels were separated from the Union line by about a mile. The The Federal Army enjoyed an interior position, while the Confederate line to cover the Federal flanks stretched almost 5 miles. On the second day of the battle, General Lee planned to turn the Federals' left flank, that is, that salient that had been pushed forward off the high ground. But the operation was poorly coordinated. Rebel artillery opened fire at 3 in the afternoon, and the assault got underway an hour later, with units being advanced piecemeal. But that attack did succeed in virtually destroying the Union troops in that salient, where a wheat field, a peach orchard, and a jumble of rocks known as the Devil's Den became synonymous with brutal hand-to-hand combat. General Meade moved 20,000 men to reinforce that flank and to counter that threat, and while the Confederate assaults pressed the Federals hard, the rebels were eventually thrown back. And that, of course, was the action where Colonel Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment played a vital role. Confederate soldiers also began to climb Little Round Top, which was critical terrain, as rebel artillery in place there could enfilade the sweep the whole length of the Federal position up Cemetery Ridge. 2 Union brigades and an artillery battery arrived at the last possible moment, denying that hill to the enemy in a desperate hand-to-hand fight. Simultaneous Confederate attacks on the Union right against Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill resulted in fierce fighting, but those Confederate assaults were also contained. The Federal Army consolidated its positions during the night, while General Lee prepared to renew the attack the next day with additional assaults on both Federal flanks. His initial plan was to continue the attacks on both the left and the right flanks of the Federal defenses. Early on 3 June, the Federals on Culp's Hill began a bombardment to regain a position lost the previous day, and the resulting battle, which ended in a stalemate, caused General Lee to change that plan. He ordered all the artillery available to concentrate and bombard the center of the Union line, and a follow-on infantry assault was intended to split the 2 wings of the Union Army. Got underway at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the artillery preparations subsided, and 12,500 rebels stepped off to cover a mile of open ground before they could reach the Federal positions. The assault was torn apart, and the survivors, about half of the men who started the attack, pulled back to their starting point. Both armies held their position throughout the 4th of July, and after dark, the Confederates began retreating back to Virginia. General Lee lost 23,231 soldiers, which included a third of the general officers in his army. That, of course, was an age when senior officers led their units from the front. Union casualties numbered 23,055 men. The battle was a disaster for the Confederacy, and when coupled with the surrender at Vicksburg, also on the 4th of July, a major turning point in the war had just been reached. Before the final assault on the Federal center went forward on the 3rd of July, Confederate General Longstreet remarked, quote, "I do not want to make this charge. I do not see how it can succeed. I would not make it now, but that General Lee has ordered it and expects it." End quote. Years later, he reflected, "I could see the desperate and hopeless nature of the charge and the hopeless slaughter it would cause. That day at Gettysburg was one of the saddest days of my life." At the height of Pickett's charge on the 3rd of July, Federal lieutenant named Frank Haskell, who was General John Gibbon's aide, took the initiative after General Gibbon was wounded, and on his own orders moved Union troops to stop the rebels who had gotten into the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. Lieutenant Haskell, who was later killed at Cold Harbor, Virginia, was widely recognized for his actions that day, and General Gibbon later wrote, quote, "I have always thought that to him, more than to any one man, we are indebted for the repulse of Lee's assault at Gettysburg." And thus ends the second campaign by the Confederates to invade the North. The second campaign that we're going to look at in this video centers around the town of Murfreesborough, Tennessee. Murfreesborough, located 10 miles southeast of Nashville, was the scene of two battles during the Civil War. The first occurred in July of 1862 and was a relatively minor action when a federal garrison was surprised and captured at the town. On the 9th of July, 1862, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a famous Confederate cavalry officer, left Chattanooga to destroy the Union supply base at Murfreesborough and arrived there with about 1,400 Confederate cavalry early on the morning of the 13th of July, quickly seizing a federal hospital. He also captured the 900-man garrison while suffering about 150 casualties before he departed from Murfreesborough. The second and more significant battle of Murfreesborough, also known as the Battle of Stones River, took place from the 31st of December, 1862 until the 2nd of January, 1863. General Bragg, commanding Confederate troops at Chattanooga, Tennessee, moved to occupy defensive positions on Stones River, northwest of Murfreesborough, a region known for strong Confederate support. He received reinforcements en route, and his force, designated the Army of the Tennessee and numbering about 38,000 men, was warmly welcomed by the local population. Union General Rosecrans concentrated his army at Nashville and began advancing toward Murfreesborough with a force of about 41,000 men. The two armies eventually established parallel lines, about 4 miles long and 700 yards apart. And both commanders planned to win by enveloping their opponent's right flank to cut communications and control the battlefield. At dawn on the 31st of December of 1862, the Confederates attacked first with a massive wave of about 10,000 soldiers, driving that portion of the Union line back almost 3 miles. General Rosecrans canceled his federal attack and moved troops to reinforce the threatened sector, but by mid-morning the Confederates had captured 28 Union cannon and 3,000 federal prisoners. Follow-on Confederate attacks forced the Union troops to pivot back onto a railroad line, while reinforcements and massed artillery eventually stabilized their defense. A desperate fight in a small wooded area on the Union Army's left flank, later known as Hell's Half Acre, was the only part of the original federal position to hold firm. By late afternoon, the battle was over, and New Year's Day was relatively quiet, with both armies collecting their wounded, although the Federals moved artillery to better cover the battlefield. A total of 57 guns were positioned to enfilade the Confederate attack that developed mid-afternoon on the 2nd of January, 1863. The assault stalled with heavy losses, and the following day the Federals received a supply train from Nashville. Knowing that General Rosecrans would continue to receive reinforcements, the Confederates began to retreat during that night. Union troops occupied Murfreesborough, but made no effort to pursue the rebels, who had lost 11,700 men. Union casualties totaled 12,000. Of all the battles fought during the Civil War, the battle at Murfreesborough saw the highest percentage of troops in the fight, either killed or wounded, and the numbers were greater, the total numbers were greater than either those suffered at the battles of Shiloh or Antietam, both fought earlier that year. Before invading Kentucky, General Bragg addressed his troops in the hyperbole popular at the time, and he said, "The enemy is before us, devastating our fair country, imprisoning our old and venerated men, even the ministers of God, insulting our women and desecrating our altars. It is our proud lot to be assigned the duty of punishing and driving forth these deluded men, led by desperate adventurers and goaded on by abolition demagogues and demons. Let us but deserve success, and an offended deity will certainly assure it." Union General Rosecrans' advice to his troops had been more on the practical side. He said, "Be cool, keep your ranks, do not throw away your fire. Fire slowly and deliberately. Above all, fire low, and be always sure of your aim. Close readily in upon the enemy, and when you get within charging distance, rush upon him with the bayonet. Do this duty, and victory will certainly be yours." A man named R.B. Stewart was a Union soldier in a unit on the right flank and recounted his experience when the early morning Confederate attack arrived on the 31st of December. And he later wrote, "Just as I had taken my meat and coffee from the fire, I was sitting down on a cold rock to eat my breakfast. A few shots rang through the woods to our front. We had hardly time to be alarmed before others followed, and then we heard bullets singing uncomfortably near and saw the pickets rushing back in, followed by a line of gray yelling and shooting like demons. Dropping our pots and pans, leaving our haversacks and blankets behind, we snatched up our cartridge boxes and rushed for our guns. We stood to deliver one round of fire, to say good morning to the rebels, and then we took to our heels and ran. But not all of us. Some fell right there. Many lingered too long with their breakfast dishes. Our way was through a cornfield. The ground was frozen and rough. I could hear the bullets striking the corn stalks. I could hear them striking a comrade as he ran. I could hear the wild yelling behind us and the roar of guns that were now getting into action. I saw a gray mass of men covering all the ground where our camp had so recently been located. At the lower end of the field was a high rail fence. I could not get to it for the crowd that was ahead of me. We all wanted to get over that fence first, but many never got over it at all. None of us sat on the top rail to rest. Some tumbled off and ran no further. We continued our retreat until we crossed the small creek about 1 mile from where we had started. Here we seemed to be at a distance safe enough to stop and catch our breath and gather ourselves together. The flag was still with us, and 1 or 2 of our regimental officers made a rallying point for the regiment. And so ended the Second Battle of Murfreesborough. Although the Confederates had been successful in surprising the Federal troops, they nonetheless were required to pull back and return to their defensive positions at Chattanooga, setting up the Union campaign that eventually captured Chattanooga and then moved south down a rail line toward Atlanta. And until then, God bless each and every one of us, and God bless America.